Right, as we begin to explore the relationship between brain and overall bodily movement, there's a very useful concept that would help us to take on board, which is the idea of the degrees of freedom of control. Now, the term control turns out to be something of a problem. There is a field called motor control, and we often speak as if the brain controlled the body, but we need to understand that in the right way. Consider this puppet. We would conventionally say the puppet is controlled by the puppeteer. And in this case, you can see that there are 4 strings from the puppeteer to the puppet. Now that places all the agency, all the doing, it places on the side of the puppeteer, and it places none on the side of the puppet. And in this particular instance, there are 4 chords, so 4 things which the puppeteer could, in principle, move independently of each other. We say that there are 4 degrees of freedom. Now, it turns out that's quite difficult. If you were given 4 separate strings and you were asked to control a puppet using them, you would find it difficult. And you can see that this puppeteer has made use of a piece of wood to organize those 4 so that they're actually linked, so that the job gets simpler. So that the effective degrees of freedom here is less than 4. Now, if we consider the brain to be controlling everything in movements, then we have to ask, well, what's the equivalent of those strings? How many things is it controlling? And it turns out that this is going to produce a problem which will convince us that the term control is probably not helpful here. Let's consider me moving my arm to pick up a cup. Now, it's not easy to say what's being controlled there. If we consider the position of the upper arm and the position of the lower arm and the position of the hand, and we simplify greatly, then we could say that there are 7 things separate. Let me count them up for you, 7 degrees of freedom. In the upper arm, I can move it up and down, side to side, and I can also rotate it. So that's 3 separate ways I can control the upper arm. The lower arm, well, here we've just introduced a hinge joint at the elbows, and that's a very simple joint. It's just 1 more degree of freedom. The wrist is fiercely complicated. I'm simplifying when I say there are 3 degrees of freedom, but basically I can move it sideways, forward and backwards, and I can also rotate. So just like the shoulder, 3 degrees of freedom. That would be 7 degrees of freedom, 7 things that could be independently controlled when I just want to move my hand to pick up a cup. But joints are, these parts of the body are not controlled directly. So what happens is that when we pay attention to the number of degrees of freedom, we ask, well, how many things need to be controlled in order to exercise control over these degrees of freedom? The number goes up and up and up. So these degrees of freedom, 1 at the elbow, 3 at the shoulder, and 3 at the wrist, they relate only to the position of the upper arm, the lower arm, or the hand. But each joint movement is controlled by multiple muscles. Now, each of those muscles could, in principle, be controlled independently. So we've added more strings. So if there were, for example, 10 muscles controlling each of those degrees of freedom, then the number of degrees of freedom went up by a factor of 10. But each muscle is actually made up of individual muscle packets, each of which can be activated separately from the others. So the number just exploded up again. And then within a muscle packet, they've got individual nerve fibers connecting to individual muscle cells, which blows the number of degrees of freedom up again. In fact, the number of degrees of freedom approaches infinity for even the simple movement. There are far, far too many individual degrees of freedom for each to be separately controlled. This is an insight we owe to Nikolai Bernstein, who was a Russian physiologist working shortly after the Russian Revolution, around the same time as Lev Vygotsky, who we've also met. So his work, which we don't have time to study in detail, made it quite clear that when we speak of the brain controlling the body, we're speaking very loosely indeed, and if we take that too literally, it's just wrong. There's way too many things to be controlled, and furthermore, simple observation of any kind of animal movement will show that biological movement is always coordinated. We don't move as if we had an infinite number of degrees of freedom that could be separately controlled. Multiple parts of the body move together in concert in order to achieve goals. And those goals are what characterizes behavior, of course. So we tend to think intuitively that all behaviors arise from controllers. That separation of the puppeteer from the puppet is a problem, though, and the study of coordinated movement suggests otherwise. Here's a little lesson that we can learn from robotics. Here's a bit of a lecture given by Rolf Pfeifer, who has built 3 different Lego robots, all of which have the same underlying controller, which here would be a driving mechanism. I'll let him explain.
Now, I'm going to show you a few behaviors. And whenever you observe a particular behavior, the question arises as to what the underlying mechanisms are that bring this behavior about. So now here's one that I like very much. We call him Crazy Bird. There's another one. So the question is now, what are the mechanisms, or what is the control that's actually underlying the behavior of these creatures? Now, it turns out that, and of course we know because we built the systems. This is the control. So it's basically just the wheels turning at a constant speed. Okay, now if you remember Crazy Bird, it was doing all sorts of things, but the control is just this. And by the way, the control for all of these 3 creatures is exactly the same, but they do very different things. So the diversity in the behavior of Crazy Bird cannot possibly be due to the diversity of the control, because the control is, I mean, you can hardly call this control. It's just these wheels turning at a constant speed.
Now, he's speaking from the perspective of a roboticist. And he's built these robots, and the originating force, the originating power that drives these various behaviors is just a single rotation. Rotation is the same underlying cause for all the very diverse behaviors. So the degrees of freedom problem tells us that we should not think of the brain in this simplistic puppeteer sense as controlling the body, and that when we want to understand behavior, we'll have to take the entire body and, it turns out, the environment into account as well.